Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. A couple weeks ago I did a video about this thing, the Retroid Pocket dual screen attachment, and I love the concept, the idea of adding something to your current handheld to enhance it a bunch, adding multitasking and the ability to play dual screen games. I think that is a lovely solution. In that video, I showed off that there is some pretty gnarly input latency from the bottom to the top screen, and so that's what we're going to focus on here today, as well as some other updates. And I'm happy to report that yes, a new firmware update for this screen actually fixes the input latency by a ton. But in life, and also Star Wars, there has to be a balance to the Force. For every good thing, there's always something bad as well. And this is no exception here with the Retroid Pocket dual screen. We'll talk about this today because it does affect compatibility with certain devices in particular. And this is not going to be my final review of this attachment because I'm still waiting on that XL extension thing that I can try out on other devices. So I don't know how many videos I'm going to make about this dumb thing, but this is the second, and then we obviously will have at least one more after this. Either way, we got a lot to talk about, so grab a snack and drink. Let's go ahead and get started. Okay, to start, this is a new screen attachment sent over from Retroid. It arrived just yesterday. You can see it's a different color. This one they're calling transparent white. They also sent over the official ribbon cable. So you can see here it's got this kind of plastic rubber feel to it. It is flat and very bendy, which is great because we have to do some pretty crazy angles to get this to work. So we've got one 90-degree angle right here, and then it comes out and around, and then another one down below. Now, this has this little trough right here, and you're supposed to be able to attach the screen to that so it doesn't poke out as much. But I found that if you push it down too much into there, I think it puts too much stress right here on this joint. And so I have not been using this part of it and just kind of letting it hang freely just because I'm worried about the wear and tear on this one angle. And so I like the idea of it being really neat and tidy, but in practice, I just haven't wanted to do that because I don't want to put additional strain on any part of this cable. But other than that, the experience is going to be exactly the same. This is the Retroid version of this dual screen attachment, so it is made for devices like the Retroid Pocket Mini that I'm using right here and the Retroid Pocket 5. I go into more detail in my previous video. I'll leave it linked down below. So if you want to hear more about, like the colors, as well as like the brightness buttons here on the side and the pass-through charging, I would recommend checking out that video. Now, I didn't need a whole new screen sent over to me, but they were sending over the cable, and so they decided to just send over a new screen at the same time, which is great because it allowed me to test both the old and new screens side by side. And the firmware flash that they did on these new screens came out after they had already started shipping some of them. So for those who were affected where they got an older screen sent to them, or at least an older firmware, they're going to be sending a cable to those owners that'll allow them to flash it themselves. For everybody else, they are getting the new firmware update just directly from the factory, so it won't be a concern except for those very early orders. Initially, Retroid said that there wasn't going to be a fix for it, that it just had those 3 frames of delay that I showed in my video, but later on they said, you know what, we actually figured out a fix that allows us to rotate the screen without having to introduce a bunch of latency, and so that's what they've done. They've also finished their over-the-air update for the Retroid Pocket Mini and Retroid Pocket 5, which allows the software to be compatible with this screen too. Now, if you go into the handheld settings, in the Connect TV section, there's now an option that allows you to choose your video output mode. By default, it's going to be the 1920 by 1080. That's what you would use when plugging it into a TV. But then you have the opposite here for the Retroid dual screen. And so selecting that and then plugging in the screen is what allows it to rotate it to make it fit this display properly, but then also reduce that input lag. One thing worth noting, if you do swap between the two, you have to unplug and plug back in the cable just to make sure that everything works properly. And so that's the big news here. They fixed the rotation delay, and it now is an option within the settings. They also said that this process improves the battery over the other, and we will test that here in a moment. Now, in addition to this good stuff, there are some bad stuff too, and number one here is compatibility with other devices. And the issue is that other devices like the Odin 2 Portal do not naturally rotate the display because it doesn't have that same setting within the handheld settings. And so you can see that by default it's going to be a portrait display but the landscape screen, and so it's a really small image and isn't correct. I've tried to figure out a solution on my own, for example the rotation control app, which I will sometimes use on other handhelds, but unfortunately it only affects this screen and not the extension screen, and so I haven't been able to rotate this screen myself. And this is going to be the same for basically any other Android device that works with this display, is that it's not going to rotate correctly. So there needs to be some other solution here because it reduces compatibility by a bunch. Now, as part of the update announcement, they also said that this screen is not going to work on the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, even though they said that it was going to previously. And what they did is they actually went into their customer database. They looked at everybody who had bought a Retroid Pocket 4 Pro and then also had bought a dual screen attachment and no other device. And they went through and auto refunded all those folks. And I think that's kind of crazy, because what if somebody bought a Retroid Pocket 5 like used or on Amazon and planned on using that screen for that, and they just got it auto refunded? So I think that was a little bit weird. To complicate this even further, I just got a note in Discord from them that says that they actually found a fix for the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. It's going to work just fine with an OTA update. And apparently MediaTek, which is the company that made the chip in the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro, said it wasn't going to work and then sent them a bunch of tools and schematics, and then the Retroid team figured it out. And so they were able to get it fixed. And so I don't know what that means, if they're going to reorder it for everybody or what, but it does look like there's going to be an announcement that the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro is going to work with this display and the new firmware. But that obviously doesn't solve the issue for non-Retroid devices like the Odin 2 Portal, which I think would be a great match for this display. And so this requires more testing, and I think that Retroid could maybe think of a solution for it as well, especially if they're going to be selling an XL line, which is supposed to work with other devices. Now, when it comes to the Steam Deck, in the gaming mode, it will also rotate it, so it's going to look wonky. But if you go into desktop mode, you can go and actually physically rotate the screen so you can get it to work. But of note, this display makes like a high-pitched whining noise when you plug it into the Steam Deck. So obviously some sort of data is being pushed over, and it's a little bit scary. And so I don't really plan on using this with the Steam Deck until that sound goes away, because I'm not sure what's going on here. Either way, when it comes to rotation, yes, this is something that you can adjust in the settings, but only in desktop mode, not when you're in the regular game mode. Same thing in Windows. You have the ability to go into the display settings and change the orientation of your secondary display. And so in that regard, yes, it's going to work fine with Windows. This one also doesn't have that same high-pitched whine when I plug it in, which is always a good sign. Now, obviously, I'm going to do a lot more compatibility testing in the future, but I did want to show that in SteamOS as well as in Windows, you have the ability to rotate a secondary display. I've been getting a lot of questions about the GPD Win 4, so I just wanted to show this off really quickly, in that this one does not seem to work with the external display. I get this error here that says USB device not recognized. Now, my Lenovo Legion Go also gave me this error, but it actually did output to the second screen. So I'm not sure what's going on here. This is an older version of the Win 4, so maybe newer versions work with it. But unfortunately, yeah, this one is not working. So yeah, there's got to be a balance in the force, and I just wanted to give this caveat that compatibility seems to be worse in this new firmware update than it was previously. There are some workarounds, especially in Windows as well as in Linux, but with Android, this is going to be a more complicated solution. Okay, now let's talk about input latency. Now, I talked about this a lot in my previous video, so just a quick recap is that I filmed everything with a 240 frames per second camera and then counted the frames when I pressed on the button and then when the character actually moves. And in my previous video, which is where this footage is from, it was a 12 frame delay between the bottom and top screen when showing the same content. And if we calculate 12 frames on a 240 frames per second camera playing 60 frames per second content, that means that we essentially are getting 3 frames of delay between the bottom and top screen in real time. And so today I sat down and did all of my testing again, including my first initial test. This is with the original screen, with the original firmware, and then also my Retroid Pocket 5 without the over-the-air update. So this is kind of that worst case scenario like we were showing before, 22 frames on the bottom of delay, and then 34 frames up top. Now, as a comparison, I did the exact same test, but with the Retroid Pocket 5 that has the new software update, and then also that new screen, which has the firmware update. And on the bottom screen, I got an average of 21 frames of input delay, and that's very close to 22 that I was getting originally. It's probably just a rounding error between the 10 different average jumps that I calculated. So I'm not worried that there is a 1 frame per second change on a 240 frames per second camera. The big change is going to be up top. Instead of getting 12 frames difference between the two, it's now reduced down to 4. And when playing 60 frames per second content, that means that there is a 1 frame delay in real time, and to me it is not perceptible as I'm playing it. Now, I also ran the exact same RetroArch test, but with the Retroid Pocket Mini, which also had an over-the-air update, and then also obviously that new screen. The interesting thing here is that the delay was better on the Retroid Pocket Mini compared to the Retroid Pocket 5, only 18 frames altogether. And the delay between the two was actually 5 frames, so a little bit worse on this, but again, 1 frame out of 240 per second. And all told, 23 frames of delay is still better than 25 frames of delay that we were getting on the Retroid Pocket 5 anyway. So what I'm seeing here is a big improvement in the overall latency to the point where I previously could feel it when I was playing these games, and then I now no longer can feel it. I've mentioned it many times before, but I am not the world's expert when it comes to detecting input delay, but the fact that I could previously and I can no longer is a big change for me. Let's move on and talk about 3DS latency. So here's a quick snapshot of what I had shown in my previous video as well. On the top right, we've got our original hardware with a new Nintendo 2DS XL, and this one had 14 frames of delay on the actual hardware. On the bottom left, we have the Azahar 3DS emulation app running in just a single screen mode, and this got me 35 frames of delay. On the bottom right, we have the dual screen setup, but with the old display and firmware, and you can see that yes, there was a 10 frame delay between the two. So these are the specs that we saw previously, 35 frames on the bottom and then 45 frames up top. Now, jumping back into my testing here today with the updated Retroid Pocket 5 as well as that new screen, I still got 35 frames of delay on the bottom display. However, up top, it is a big change. Instead of having 10 frames of delay, it is now down to 3. That means that when playing 3DS games at 60 frames per second, it's going to be less than 1 frame of delay between the two. And again, putting it into real-world context, now when playing 3DS games, it feels natural. Yes, there's already some inherent input delay just in the fact that you're using emulation, but I no longer can feel the difference between the top and bottom screens. Okay, one more test here with the original DS. So on the top right, we've got the DSi XL, and this has got 14 frames of delay on original hardware. On the bottom left, I've got Melon DS running in single screen mode, and yes, 30 frames of delay just inherent in this emulator. On the bottom right, we've got the old setup with the old screen, and this gave me 42 frames of delay, so a 12 frame delay difference between the top and the bottom. Fast forward to today, I've got the new display as well as that new software update, and I'm still getting 30 frames of delay on the bottom display. But here's the thing, and I don't know if you're going to believe me about this, but the top display is actually faster than the bottom display in Melon DS. It's now 28 frames of delay. I had to count this so many times to make sure I wasn't going crazy. Effectively, what happens is when I press on the button, the Mario up top jumps before the Mario on the bottom. And I have no idea what's going on here. It must be how the video is processed in this app in particular, but this is kind of like a best case scenario where it actually got faster. If you don't believe me, let me go ahead and slow things down and zoom in. So I'm going to press on the button here, and if you look, I'm going to freeze it right now. You can see that Mario is just starting to jump up top, but he's still completely stationary down below. So obviously something is happening here, and it's ideal because that means that yes, it feels super snappy up top compared to down below. And given the fact that the majority of DS games have all the action happening up top, this is a best case scenario. And I probably tested this app a good 30 times to make sure that my numbers weren't off here, and yeah, somehow the top screen is faster than the bottom one. I also had a similar experience when using these stopwatch apps that I had tried in the previous video too. Now in that old video I had misspoke and I had thought that maybe some of these were running faster, but I was thinking that the lower the number the better, but actually the lower number up top indicates that there's input lag. However, I did notice this time around that yes, the higher number is up top, which is actually a good thing. That means the app is running faster up top than it is down below. Again, we're talking about a minute difference here, but yes, there were moments where I actually saw the stopwatch running faster up top than on the bottom screen. Another thing I noticed when doing this testing doesn't really have to do with the numbers showing on the screen because they're basically identical between the two, but I saw that the ads, which are actually showing down below the numbers in this particular app, ran faster up top than they did on the bottom. So for example, this ad is going to transition from a dark banner to a light one. And if we pause it right in the middle of the transition, you can see that the bottom display is a little bit darker than it is up top. What this says to me is that the swipe is happening faster on the top display than it is on the bottom. So again, another indicator that with certain apps in particular, the latency isn't there at all. So when it comes down to it, here's my take on the input latency. When playing action games like platformers, which are the ones where I can feel this difference the most, I can no longer feel a difference. I've already mentioned that I'm not the best at detecting input latency, and so if you are very sensitive to it, you still might notice it. But I think that for kind of your average emulation user like me, I think that it'll probably be pretty good. To put it another way, I did not really use my screen that much over the past 2 weeks after making the video because I found it to be unplayable, especially with my favorite Mario games, but now I actually find it really enjoyable. In fact, I'm really looking forward to playing more games like this. So depending on the app, there isn't a zero latency solution between the top and bottom screens, but for everything that I tested and all the games that I actually care about, DS, 3DS, and playing on RetroArch, all that worked perfectly fine to the point where I didn't really notice it myself. Now, another thing that Retroid had told me is that the battery life was improved with this new firmware update because it doesn't have to deal with, rotating the screen all the time. So let's get a baseline with the old battery stats and compare it to the new. In a single screen setup here, in my previous video, I showed that I got about 21% battery drain in 1 hour of playing 3DS games at a 4x resolution. This allows me to calculate that I would expect about 4 hours and 46 minutes of gameplay time when going from 100% battery to 0%. Now, when doing that same 1 hour test, but with the dual screen setup, I got a 33% battery drain this time. And that calculation would be reduced down to 3 hours and 2 minutes altogether. And so next, earlier today, I did the exact same setups. Metroid Samus Returns, 4x resolution with the 3DS emulator here, and I tested it for 1 hour, and I got a 30% battery drain instead of 33. This means that if we were to calculate 100% to 0% battery drain, we are looking at an additional 20 minutes of gameplay time. Now, I think there are a couple takeaways here. Number one is that it's always great to get more battery life, but again, 18 minutes is not a huge difference between the two. At the same time, I also think that, getting over 3 hours of gameplay time when playing Nintendo 3DS games at a 4x resolution upscale is still a pretty great experience. So at least when it comes to playing 3DS games with a dual screen setup, yes, it is going to drain the battery faster, which again makes sense because it has 2 screens that it needs to output to, but it is a little bit better than it was previously. And also bear in mind that I'm playing at a 50% brightness here, and so depending on your environment, you may get better or worse battery life too. One other battery test I did is with PSP running on the Retroid Pocket Mini. Now, originally this one got me a 9% battery drain over 1 hour, which gives you 11 hours and 7 minutes on the Retroid Pocket Mini. But the big drawback of this setup is that the screen looks really small on this squarish aspect ratio display. One of the great things about using this new dual screen attachment is that it allows you to play full 16:9 content on a 5.5-inch display, which really transforms your gaming experience on the Retroid Pocket Mini. But as I demonstrated in that last video, it basically halves your battery life. Instead of getting a 9% drain in 1 hour, I got 18% instead. That still gives me 5.5 hours of gameplay time with PSP, but that is a big reduction to be able to push the video out on that secondary display. Now today I sat down and did the exact same thing. I played Virtual Tennis World Tour for another hour until my eyes basically bled, and I got an 18% battery drain again. So as far as this test is concerned, when I'm just displaying 16:9 content on a secondary display on the Retroid Pocket Mini, I'm not seeing any improvement with this new firmware fix. And like I mentioned with the 3DS, getting 5.5 hours of gameplay time playing PSP at a 4x resolution upscale on an OLED 5.5-inch display is still a really nice upgrade, and I think that 5.5 hours for me is still a pretty good amount overall. It's only when you compare it against the 11 hours that you can get natively on the device that it starts to feel a little bit low. But either way, it's obviously going to be up to you and whether or not this battery life is going to be tolerable. So in summary, yes, I found that the input delay is greatly improved here to the point where I'm actually enjoying playing on these games. I got kind of bummed about the Retroid dual screen after my last video where I was like, man, I had so much hope for this thing as a cool accessory, and then it all kind of got dashed once I saw that input latency. And now it feels like I'm kind of on a roller coaster ride because now that I'm using it again, I'm like, man, this is actually pretty neat. In particular, my favorite way to play has been with the Retroid Pocket Mini just because it completely transforms the overall feel of this device. Instead of having everything kind of cramped into that squarish display, which is fun in its own way depending on the system that you're playing, it's really cool that I can also now play everything in 16:9. The Retroid Pocket 5 experience is still very cool. You're basically just duplicating the screen that you already have, but there is something magical about doing it on the Retroid Pocket Mini version too. It's not going to be a perfect experience with every game. For example, Sonic Rush is an excellent example. This is one of those games where you have to see both screens at once, and on the original DS, they were the exact same size. But because we have these conflicting aspect ratios, we do have a little bit of a mismatch. So up top, it's going to be a larger display because it's showing that 4:3 on a 16:9, and then down below it'll be a little bit smaller because we're showing a 4:3 display on something that's more squarish. It's actually a 31:27 aspect ratio. So whether or not this is going to bother you to the point where you can't play Sonic Rush or maybe Contra 4, that's all obviously going to be up to you. Personally, I think that the vast majority of DS games are going to be absolutely fine with that smaller screen down below, especially because that was generally a secondary display. And I personally love the mismatch when it comes to 3DS games just because, the top aspect ratio in 3DS was wider. It was 5:3 aspect ratio, which is an excellent fit with this display too. And of course, it's not all just about dual screen gaming. I love the idea of multitasking on my device too. For example, if I wanted to play, like a widescreen hack of a PS2 game like here, and then I can also have like a media player down below. Maybe I'm listening to some good tunes, or maybe I want to watch a YouTube video. I can do all of that at the same time. I personally like the idea of listening to music while I'm playing a game that I've already played so many times before, and so this is kind of a neat setup. Another update in the software, if we swipe down from the top, we now have these volume buttons right here. And that's because the screen itself covers up the physical volume buttons. So if you want to adjust the volume as you're playing, you can just kind of change it right here. However, this does bring up a point that is lacking in the software. For example, say I'm playing Super Mario 64 up top, and then I want to listen to my favorite music down below. Now, unfortunately, this does not have an audio mixer, the ability to basically turn down the volume on the game and turn up the volume on your music and vice versa. If you turn up the volume on this device, it's just going to raise it for both the music as well as the game, which can get quite annoying as you can imagine. And I also reported this to the Retroid team. They said that they are going to work on an audio mixer to allow us to adjust this as well. I tried a couple other fixes. For example, there is a Samsung app called Sound Assistant, which allows you to adjust multiple apps at once, but unfortunately, it doesn't work on this device. It just crashes. Okay, so wrapping up, I'm not going to do like a full what I like and what I dislike because this is still kind of a work in progress, but I will talk about the good and the bad so far with this update. The good is that yes, input latency is a lot better here to the point where I'm actually enjoying playing on this thing now. I'm not seeing any huge improvements when it comes to battery life, but it was a little bit better than it was a couple weeks ago. As far as bad, I think there are a couple things that still need work. Number one is going to be compatibility. Now that they've made this new firmware update, it kind of breaks compatibility with certain devices. So I do think there is some work that needs to be done on that end, especially because this screen is really awesome and I want to use it on other devices. At the very least, I think that if they share information with like AYN and Ambernic, potentially they could just implement it in an over-the-air update to allow for compatibility with this display, because I think it's a win for everybody. I'm also hoping to see an audio mixer sometime in the future because now that multitasking is working so nicely, I want the ability to change where I'm hearing the audio. So even though this isn't like a final review, I've still got more things to test. I did want to just kind of talk about the state of how things are and whether or not I recommend this overall setup. Number one, this definitely needs more testing. I especially want to test it with other devices, Windows, Steam, as well as Android. And so that's why I'm waiting on that XL attachment to be able to see if I can fit this on other devices. Things have been pushed back a little bit because of all these firmware updates, but I am expecting to see it in maybe about a week and a half, and then I can try it all again. As it stands right now, I can only really recommend this attachment if you're happy with it as it is right now, which means that it works really great with the Retroid Pocket Mini as well as the Retroid Pocket 5, but everything else is kind of wonky. And I'd like to see more software updates, including an audio mixer, before I can really make a full recommendation one way or the other. And admittedly, the introduction of dual screen devices themselves have kind of taken a little bit of the wind out of the sails of this Retroid Pocket dual screen attachment. I still think it's really neat to be able to take a device that you already own and then spend $70 to enhance it even more, to be able to give you multitasking functions or dual screen gameplay, as opposed to buying a whole new handheld. I like the idea of upgrading what you already have. But there's also something very sleek and premium about the upcoming Thor and Pocket DS handhelds. I've been kind of thinking of it like the idea of slapping a controller on a phone. That's something that basically anybody could do to get that handheld gaming experience, but it's not the same as using an actual handheld. I mean, that's why I started this channel in the first place. And it kind of feels a little bit like that with the dual screen attachment, in that you are kind of slapping something onto something that already exists, and it's not a cohesive whole like the renders are of that AYN Thor in particular. That thing looks beautiful. So be on the lookout for another Retroid dual screen video at some point, once they get me the XL attachment and once we've seen some more software updates, and hopefully it'll be working with the Retroid Pocket 4 Pro. My plan is to make just like a big compatibility video where I'm going to test out a bunch of devices and tell you what works and what doesn't, and then we'll wrap that all up together and make that final review. Let me know if you have any questions down below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.